And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are really honored today to have an outstanding writer and professor with us today to talk about his writing and his career as a writer and his career as a professor. He was a Pulitzer Prize Finalist in fiction a few years ago, and his name is Lee Martin. And Lee Martin joins us today as a Pulitzer Prize Finalist for the book The Bright Forever. He's also the author of 4 other novels, Quakertown, River of Heaven, Break the Skin, and Late One Night. His other books are the memoirs Such a Life, From Our House, and Turning Bones. And he's also the author of short story collections The Least You Need to Know and The Mutual UFO Network. He's also the author of the craft book Telling Stories, The Craft of Narrative and The Writing Life. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in such places as Harper's, The Best American Essays, The Best American Mystery Stories, Creative Nonfiction, The Georgia Review, The Kenyon Review, and others. He's a winner of the Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction and has earned fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Ohio Arts Council. He teaches in the MFA Program at The Ohio State University, where he was the winner of the 2006 Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. And we are welcome and honored to have Lee Martin with us here today on the program. So Lee, welcome to Chapters. Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot, Elliot. It's a real pleasure to be down here in Huntington.
Well, great to have you. And I must admit that I found out about you as a writer and your career as a writer and a professor because I stalked you on Twitter, and you have an active Twitter account, and that's where I came across you and some of the things that you write about. And I'll ask you in a couple minutes about Twitter, but you had a post recently. One of the things I really like about your social media feed is you have a lot of good, insightful articles about writing and the process that comes through the blog section on your website, but you always start your Twitter feeds with some inspirational words about writing and about life. And this is something that you posted recently, which it really connected with me. It says, "I spent a year and a half working in a tire repairs manufacturing plant, and the people there taught me what a writer needs to know about strength, courage, perseverance, and grace. And for that, I give thanks." Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what those people taught you about writing and about life?
Well, often I start to think about how writers sometimes are complainers. The work's not going well, the work's not being received well, that sort of thing. I don't have time. And every time I start to whine like that, I think about the year and a half I spent working in that plant. And working with these really good-hearted people who had their flaws, sure, like all of us do. But they taught me a lot about the nature of work and how to maintain your dignity and your joy while doing sort of mind-numbing work and work that breaks your body down. And so I really value all those days that I spent burning my arms on the press machines when I was molding plugs for tires and patches for tires.
Yeah, very good. And I wanted to ask you, connected to that, as we talked about a moment ago, you've got a lot of really good articles that you write through that Twitter feed about writing. How long have you been doing that, and what value do you find in that in terms of being able to kind of share your experience, and not just your personal experience like you did here, but your writing experience and your successes and problems that you've had? How does that help you, and why do you find value in that?
Well, I didn't want to do it at first. I went kicking and screaming into this weekly blog that I do. I had a new web page designed, and the web designer said, the most important part of this is your blog. And I said, but I don't want to have a blog. And he said, no, really, trust me, it's the most important thing. I said, no, I don't want to do it. And eventually he convinced me to do one, and so I started doing it. And it's probably been 6-7 years maybe I've done it. And I fell in love with it. It gives me a chance to think more deeply about craft issues that are coming up in my writing workshops, to continue the conversation with students that we have around the workshop table. And it just allows me to think more deeply about my own craft.
I wanted to ask you, too, about one of your books, and this was the first book of yours that I read, Telling Stories, The Craft of Narrative and the Writing Life. And as you read that book, it kind of seems like an extension of the writing that you do from your blog on your website, because you've got so many good stories in there about writing, and you've got a lot of exercises that you work into that as well after you've talked about a certain concept. And can you tell us a little bit about putting that book together and what that process was like and kind of what your goal was in putting that book together?
Well, that absolutely came as an extension of the weekly blog, no doubt about that. My intention was to create a craft book that would also include some encouraging advice about the writing life. And I think I was targeting people who are working on their writing outside of a writing community. That's why I have a lot of writing exercises in the book to help them generate material and to help them think about various issues of craft. And the final section of the book is the writing life, in which I try to offer some advice for how to live this life of a writer.
Yeah, very good. And there's so many good things in there. And I tried a couple of your writing examples and exercises out of that book, and it really was helpful. When I was writing and I had myself kind of written into a corner, I couldn't get myself jump started. Looking at your writing and your advice and your suggestions, and then tying that in with the writing exercise was a real help. So I think folks can find some value in that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, I appreciate it very much. It saved me a great deal of stress and frustration. I wanted to ask you about your most recent book, The Mutual UFO Network, which was a collection of short stories. And one of the things I found really interesting about kind of some of the themes and one of the thematic connections with the book is that you kind of have these groups of people that should be getting along, but they have fractures and fissures kind of in the relationship. So we see husbands and wives that should be getting along that aren't. We see family and friends that because of mistakes and things that they've said and done to one another kind of have some fissures that have grown in their relationship. And then sometimes the people themselves are lying to themselves over what's going on in their life because of the truth or the reality is too painful to admit. Can you talk about some of those short stories, and was that a goal when you sat down to write those stories, is to have some of those conflicts between groups of people that should get along?
Right, absolutely. The title story, The Mutual UFO Network, is about a father who has a business that creates false evidence of extraterrestrial life in the form of videotapes, etc. And it ends up fracturing that family. And it opens the book to set the theme of this alienation from one another. And so when I put the story collection together, I wanted there to be a conversation between the stories. And I think it is based on that, on exactly what you said, the fact that I think our human condition is we're always longing for connection, but we're always finding ways to avoid it. Mm-hmm. And so we end up alienated. The book is not science fiction. It's a collection of stories, domestic situations, parents and children and husbands and wives and neighbors who find themselves in that awkward position of wanting contact and yet having something go awry in that quest.
I wanted to ask you about one of the stories in the book, too, that I thought was really interesting, and that was Across the Street. And that's a story about two parents who are buying a house for their son, Jim, and they're doing this because they want him to live on his own after years of him living in group homes and institutions and a variety of different places. But then his new neighbors kind of discover his peculiarities. So tell us a little bit about Jim there and what's going on in that story.
Well, Jim is a troubled person, and his parents are essentially washing their hands of him and trying to set him up in an independent living situation. But as you say, the neighbors start to notice some of his odd behaviors. For example, he likes to go out at night and lie in the middle of the cul-de-sac and look up at the stars. And the neighbors are worried that someone's going to hit him with a car at some point, which comes close to happening. But at the end of the story, when the neighbors are all gathered around him and somebody asks him if he knows where he is, he says, "I'm in my neighborhood, I'm with my neighbors." And what happens at that point is this very human desire to be a part of a group rises to the surface of the story. And so the story has this ending of coming together on Thanksgiving. Thanks for mentioning that. It's the season for it. On Thanksgiving night. And they're all going to watch for the comet Ison through one of the neighbors' telescopes, just the way that people do, being together.
Absolutely. And speaking of two other characters who were together, but maybe after a while realize maybe they don't want to be, is Ansel and Lucy in your story, The Last Civilized House, which is another one I really liked. They've been married for about 55 years, but there's a little bit of resentment and anger kind of bubbling up to the surface between their relationship because an incident from a number of years ago resurfaces and really puts a strain on their relationship. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in that story?
Well, the story opens with Ansel being outside his house on a winter day, walking through the snow, and he notices that there are footprints going around the perimeter of the house, and he notices that those footprints have turned at each window so the person could look inside. And that's really what dredges up the hurt from the past. I won't give too much away, but because of a certain episode in this long-term marriage. And the rest of the story is sort of tracing the development of that secret from the past and how it comes to play in the present of the lives of Ansel and Lucy.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I found myself sort of irritated with Ansel and Lucy at various times, but also felt sorry for them too because of this circumstance and this incident. And we don't want to give too much away, but
Right.
They're interesting. They're very sympathetic characters, both of them, in terms of kind of what happens to them.
Well, I try to make them, as I try to make all my characters, just human.
Yeah.
And we are all made up of contradictions, and we're made up of stories that we don't even know about. We have a story that we tell ourselves about us and how we move through the world, and that's not always the complete story. Mm-hmm. And it takes the pressures of plot, as in The Last Civilized House, to bring the other narratives up to the top. So at the end of that story, they're driving home, and a car almost hits them on the snowy, icy road, but they manage to avoid disaster, and they move on toward their home, where Lucy has thought to leave the porch light on, and they drive toward that light, and they drive home, a place that he's always jokingly called The Last Civilized House, because it's on the very edge of town before you fully step out into the country.
Yeah, it's a great story, one of my favorites in the collection. I wanted to move ahead a little bit and talk about your book that was the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and that was The Bright Forever. And in this story, we meet a 9-year-old named Katie Mackey. And what's interesting about this story is this kind of connects back to some of the themes you were talking about a moment ago with the Mutual UFO Network. It's a story, it's kind of suspenseful, a deeply affecting novel, but it's kind of on that theme of the choices that people make and how those change their lives forever, and how sometimes deciding to do this or deciding not to do that can lead to certain outcomes. But I thought the story was really fast-paced, and it was gripping, and I thought it was richly human in terms of those human characteristics that you were talking about. Can you tell us about where you got some of the ideas for that story and what it was like putting that together?
Well, that novel is based upon a true story that happened in the county seat of the county that I grew up in southeastern Illinois. We changed the setting to Indiana on the advice of the publisher's attorney. It's based on that true story. It happened when I was 16 years old. This young girl went missing, and it was the first really heinous crime of that area. And it left a lasting impression upon me, particularly the 4 days when they didn't know where the girl was. And so I started to tell the story with that as the basic narrative spine. But in order to do it, I had to create other characters, and one of the characters I created was a math teacher named Henry Dees, not based upon any person that was involved in the true story, but he becomes sort of the moral compass of the story, in the sense that he's not always telling you the truth, but eventually, by the end of the book, he tells everything. And it's a book about people trying to move on with their lives in the aftermath of a great tragedy. And I was really interested in that book in the way the crime radiated out through the various populations of the community. I was talking to a high school class in Nebraska once about that book, and I told them that I'd written 200 pages in a strict third-person limited point of view before I finally figured out what I was really interested in. And so I threw those 200 pages away.
Oh, wow.
And there was a young man sitting across from me, and he leaned forward, and he had this very concerned look on his face. He said, "Dude, are you okay?" Because first of all, he couldn't imagine writing 200 pages and then to throw them away. Well, I must be a madman, right?
That's absolutely.
And I told him that was the best day, because that was the day I knew what my book was. And that's when I came up with the different point of view strategy of alternating first-person narrators in the book.
Is that challenging when you go that route of alternating characters? When you, as you said, you were going with the third-person limited, which is pretty consistent throughout, but then you decide to alternate. Is that difficult? And how do you ensure then that as you're alternating points of view that all the characters don't sound the same?
Well, that's the important thing. You have to have distinct voices for all of these narrators. And to me, that's just a matter of, it's sort of the Stanislavski method of acting, right? You put yourself in the mind and body of these individual characters, and you speak from the way they move through the world, the way they see the world. Particularly in this case, the way they move through the world 30 years beyond the tragedy at the heart of the book. And that gives you the sound of the voice.
Yeah, absolutely. This book was, as we mentioned, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. How did that come about? When did you find out it was a finalist? How did you find out? And what was that moment like for you? Because that's really a penultimate honor, I think, for a lot of writers to be in that category, to be a finalist for Pulitzer Prize.
Well, that day, I didn't even know it was the day that the Pulitzer Prizes were going to be announced, and I had no idea my publisher had nominated the book. And I'd been in a graduate student's class observing his teaching, and I came back to my office late in the day, and I opened up my email, and there was a message from a former student that said, "I'd much rather be congratulating you on winning the Pulitzer Prize, but congratulations on being a finalist." And I was stunned. I thought this was what they call in the publishing industry a quiet little book, one that doesn't get much attention. And then I had email after email, and it was startling.
Did your life as a writer change significantly after that moment?
Not really. I guess, to be honest, the expectations went up a notch for the next books. But I just keep writing every day. And I don't really feel like there was a great change in anything.
So you've written, fiction, and you've written novels, and you've written short stories. You've written several memoirs, 3 memoirs, and I know that you're possibly considering working on another one. Is there a genre that you like if you had to pick a favorite between those 3, or do you find one is more difficult to write in than the others?
No, I don't find there's any one of those genres that's easier or more difficult. And I never really meant to write memoir, but my first tenure-track teaching position, they assigned me a graduate-level creative nonfiction workshop, And I thought, well, if I'm going to teach people how to write this, I'd better try to write some of it myself. And I wrote about 4 essays that started to show me a narrative arc, and I surrendered and I became an accidental memoirist and wrote my first memoir, a book called From Our House. So I like being able to move back and forth because certain material fits better in certain genres. So I like having that flexibility.
Who are some writers that have influenced you as a writer, or maybe are some writers now that you find yourself going back to and reading and rereading for inspiration?
Richard Ford was the most influential writer for me. His first book of short stories, Rock Springs, came out in, I think, 1987, if I'm remembering correctly. And even though those stories are primarily set in the American West, I heard in the voice of the narrators the similar voice to the people I grew up with in the small towns and farming communities in southeastern Illinois. There was sort of a restraint, a dignity in the midst of suffering, a lyricism, and it gave me permission to tell the stories from the places I knew best, because like all young writers, I think all young writers, I was doubtful. I didn't think anybody would ever want to read anything about my little farms and small towns. Ford taught me that I could write those stories, and so my first book, The Least You Need to Know, owes everything to Rock Springs.
And I know that you have such a good understanding of people and how people think and react, and that comes through in your novels and your short stories and your memoirs. As you get older, time moves on, and you look back at growing up, in southeastern Illinois and some of those small town experiences. And we talked about working in the tire repairs manufacturing plant at the top of our interview. Do you find that's good fodder for you in terms of understanding character and people and how they respond and react to certain circumstances?
Absolutely. Even if I'm writing something that's set in another part of the world, I'm tapping into what I observed and what I learned about the way human beings interact in those small towns, those farming communities, in those working class neighborhoods.
Yeah, very good. So what is Lee Martin working on next?
Oh, Lee Martin is working on lots of stuff. I've got a new novel coming out in April of 2020, a book called Yours, Gene, like a signature. But in the meantime, I am playing around with this memoir idea. We'll see where that goes. And I'm in the midst of a revision of another novel.
Fantastic. So can you give us a little bit of a preview about what Yours, Gene is about?
I can. It's again based on a true story that happened in my little area of southeastern Illinois. There's enough crime that goes on there to keep me writing for a long, long time. But in 1952, on the very first day of school, the high school librarian was approached by her former fiance in the school, and he tried to convince her to take his ring back. And when she refused, he shot her 5 times. And he told the sheriff later, when she wouldn't take my ring back, what else was I to do? It was that blasted romance that caused all the problems. Now, this happens early in Yours, Gene, and the rest of the book that I'm really, really interested in is the stories of the people who came in contact with him on that day. The hotel clerk, the taxi driver, the other teacher who rented a room to the librarian. So I'm tracing the individual stories of these people as they are influenced by this murder.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Sounds like a great story. And are you going to alternate points of view in that book like you did in some of your other work, or are you going to stay with maybe a traditional point of view, or are you not know yet? Or
no, we're going to alternate points of view, but they're not going to be first person points of view.
Okay, very good, excellent. So Lee, in our final moments with you today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about their writing or your writing, or they want to follow you on Twitter and follow your blogging that you do on your website, how can they do that? And if they're interested in getting copies of your books, where can they get those?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at Lee Martin Author. My website is leemartinauthor.com. They can find me on Facebook. My students set up a fan page for me some years ago, so they can look for Lee Martin Writer. And copies of my books are available all the traditional ways, from Amazon through your independent bookstores. The last 3 books, including the one that's forthcoming, available from Dzanc Books, DZANC Books, and that's how to get them.
Great. Lee Martin has been our guest here today on Chapters. He's the Pulitzer Prize Finalist, author of the novel The Bright Forever, as well as 4 other novels, 3 memoirs, and his most recent collection of short stories, The Mutual UFO Network, is out. Lee, congratulations on all your success, the Pulitzer Prize Finalist Award, and all of the work that you're doing, and good luck to you in your future projects. And as you keep writing and publishing, we'd love to have you back on to talk about it. So thanks so much.
That would be fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Lee. We also want to take a moment to say thanks to the staff and management of Empire Books and News and the Inner Geek for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and the Inner Geek and inquire about Lee Martin's books. And we also remind you that many of the author, editor, and publishers featured on our program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square and get that reading taste or reading need you have satisfied right here at the store. And we appreciate all their support and assistance they provide us each and every episode here on Chapters. And if you'd like to stay in touch with the program via email or social media, we've got a variety of platforms that are available to you, and we've made that possible to you through those social media platforms. The first way you can do that is through our email address, and that's right here at the bottom of the screen. We do ask that you please include your name and the town or city in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. We also have a Chapters tab through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. Put that address into your search browser and look for the Chapters tab, and we have all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And we also are on Facebook, and our Facebook address is here at the bottom of the screen as well. What we have on the Facebook page is more of our recent author, editor, and publisher interviews available for you there. You can share those to your page. You can interact with viewers of the program. You can like and comment on the episodes that you're seeing right there through our Facebook page. So if you like Facebook, if you like YouTube, if you like email, we've made it possible for you to stay in contact with the program, and we know many of you do that, and we appreciate all the support and comments and feedback that you do provide. And that will do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.